here. And tonight we're doing part 3 of the history of modern Israel. So if you want to go ahead and put the slides up, starting with part 3. So we talked the first time about the Yemen and Russia coming in the first part of it. The second one, we talked about the stuff that was happening in Western Europe, and the rise of Zionism and Theodor Herzl. And today we're switching back over to Palestine and the Ottoman Empire. So this is the second part, or the second Aliyah. I think I'm still pronouncing that right. And so that was 1904 to 1914. And that's where an estimated 35,000 Jews immigrated into Palestine. Now, again, these are mostly from Yemen and Russia. Again, there was a small number that came from other parts, but mainly from those two, because, again, Yemen had, at least from a governmental thing of them moving things around, and, again, Russia had a lot of the persecution that was going over at that time. It was also the first time where there was a successful settlement that survived for a while. And that was Degania. I think I might be pronouncing that correct also. But this was just south of the Sea of Galilee. And it was the first time that they had tried what's called the kibbutz setup. And it really was a communal type setup. There certainly was a lot of socialist Jews, and especially in Europe, that were trying to use some of their things, and there was others that came there that didn't like that term, and so some of them used the term mutualism instead. But it really was a group of families getting together and working together to try to make successful, and so they used that same setup over and over. They used what was working at the time. In fact, Arthur Ruppin, who was the chief Zionist land agent, said the question was not whether group settlement was preferable to individual settlement. It was rather one of either group settlement or no settlement at all. And so, because the ones that had tried it before had not really worked. And so they used that as the example going forward. Also at this time in 1909, we had the first city. So this was a planned thing where they planned out a lot of the city. This was actually started as a neighborhood in Jaffa, which was already a city, and it had some advantages because it was right on the Mediterranean, as you can see there. And they started as a neighborhood, and so it was 60 families that started off, and they decided that they were going to build a new city. It had a different name to start with, but when they renamed it to Tel Aviv, it was really named after Theodor Herzl's novel, which it translates to Old New Land. And so it was a way of honoring him. He had died a few years earlier, and so it was another way of that they were honoring him by naming the city after one of his books. If you look to the Palestine population, again, there was some Jews there even before the first people from Yemen arrived. But there was a lot of different things that were happening in growth. So I put just a couple of years up, and these are just estimates on what they had at the time. But you can see that in the 1882, it was about 88% Muslim, about 3% Jews, and about 9% Christian, actually, in there. By the year 1900, the Muslim population, although it had grown quite a bit, the percentage had shrunk down to 85%. Jews were now about 4%, and Christians were 11%. And then by 1914, Muslims were 84%, still dropped a little bit, Jews up to 5%, and the Christians stayed at 11%. So there's a lot of things happening in the population, and of course that created some tension in that area as well, because the population saw that there was more and more people coming, and so there was a lot of tension or disagreements or misunderstandings and all. And the Israeli historian Benny Morris had this quote that I'll read. It says, but the major cause of tension and violence throughout the period of 1882 to 1914 was not accidents, misunderstandings, or the attitudes and behaviors of either side, but objective historical conditions and the conflicting interests and goals of the two populations. The Arabs sought instinctively to retain the Arab and Muslim character of the region and to maintain their position as its rightful inhabitants. The Zionists sought radically to change the status quo, buy as much land as possible, settle on it, and eventually turn an Arab-populated country into a Jewish homeland. For decades, the Zionists tried to camouflage their real aspirations for fear of angering the authorities and the Arabs. They were, however, certain of their aims and of the means needed to achieve them. Internal correspondence among the Jewish immigrants from the very beginning of the Zionist enterprise leaves little room for doubt. So again, there's a lot of stuff going on, different aims that cause those tensions, even between the populace, at that time. So it started well before, any other Balfour Declaration or anything else that was happening at the time. So now we're going to switch over for a minute and just talk about the Ottoman Empire, because this corresponds quite a bit with the history of Israel at the time too. So this is just a quick timeline. I started it in that 1876 when Abdul Hamid II ascended the throne. And he was the sultan or emperor, you could use that term, of them at the time. And he inherited an empire that was deteriorating. It had a lot of debt that it had amassed over a lot of different wars and stuff. It varies if you look at the history books about the percentage of revenue that was going just to pay interest on their debt, but most of it has more than 50% and some as high as 70%. Where they say, how much debt that they had and, the revenue coming in. So they were in dire straits financially, even at that time. And there was a lot of other groups, ethnic groups that were around. And at the time, they were called the Young Ottomans. And he worked with them, and they established a constitutional arrangement with a parliamentary system. And that was one of the ways that he was trying to pacify, some of the more eager people that were, upset with how the country was run at the time. And so they had a parliament. They had then a war with Russia. And then not even 2 years later, he dissolves the parliament and the constitution and comes back just as sole emperor because he couldn't get them to do what he wanted them to do at the time. And then in 1894 to 96, there was another massacre or genocide of Armenians and Assyrians. And I mentioned there's a lot of other ones that were done, but this goes very much into what I talked about last week with Herzl when he was meeting with him, and he met with him offering to help consolidate the debt, because they were very much in debt. And he got a lot of pushback, again in Europe, as I mentioned, because he was making a deal with this guy that had just done these genocides, basically wiped out different groups that were arguing with him or not doing what he wanted. And again, later there was some much worse massacres and genocides happening too. But people were accusing, why would you want to deal with such a butcher of people? On there. And then in 1908, you had the Young Turk Revolution. These are the same people that were called the Young Ottomans before, but they changed their name basically to the Young Turks. And they demanded the reestablishment of the Constitution and the Parliament, that was done before. And Abdul Hamid II just conceded right at the beginning, didn't even put up a fight, and he basically was taken out and no longer emperor, at all. Then they established Mehmed V as the Sultan. And then in 1913, there was another Ottoman coup, and that was the establishment of the three pashas. And then you had World War One starting on July 28th, 1914. Now, the three pashas was basically the government. They split the power between three people, and they called them pashas, and they each had different duties on there. So when World War One started, these aren't the three pashas, it's two of the pashas and then the sultan. But when World War One started, it put the Ottoman Empire in a little bit of a quandary about what they should do. The first guy on here, who was the prime minister, which was Mehmed Talat, he looked at the situation and he said he wanted to side, the Ottoman Empire to side with the British, the French, and the Russians, or the Entente at the time, because he felt that there would be less threat of invasion and more potential for them to help modernize, the army and gain favor with them. Because when World War One started, they all thought that it would be over within 6 months. Little did they know it would go on for 4 years and be one of the bloodiest conflicts that they had in history. So they were thinking, we just need to pick the right side, get in, and we can get some of the fruits on it. So Talat wanted to go with the Entente. The Enver Bey, who was the Pasha and the Minister of War, wanted to side with Germany. He had seen the German army. He was really impressed with how modern it was, and he thought the Germans were going to win. And so he was on board with trying to do that, or to go with Germany. Whereas Mehmed V, who was a sultan, who was largely just the ceremonial figure, didn't have really much power, he wanted just to stay out of the war completely, stay neutral on it, but again, he was largely ignored, where he was at. Now, the thing was, the Ottomans had bought 2 warships from Britain, and they were going to be delivered. But, when World War One broke out, the Britons basically said, no, you can't have them. And so they were, kind of upset with Britain at that point. And so they had, a couple days after war was declared, they made a secret alliance with Germany instead. They wanted to kind of stay out, but if Germany needed something, they would do something, for them or try to help. And what happened was there's these 2 German warships that kind of got stuck, and the British fleet was pursuing them, and the Ottomans then allowed them to have safe harbor. But they said, but you have to put them up as Ottoman flags on them, and we'll just say that we bought these instead. And Germany was in a bind; they didn't want to lose them, so they agreed to doing that. And so now the Ottomans had 2 warships that they could do. And so Enver, who wanted to side with the Germans and be part of the war, decided, hey, now's my opportunity. So he did a raid in the Black Sea on Russian ports. Just sent the ships out there, did the raids, caused all sorts of havoc on Russia, because he's like, if I can't get the Ottomans, to declare war, it's easy enough to get someone to declare war on us by going and attacking them. And so when the other pashas found that out, they tried to remove him, because he acted on his own without their input. But at that point, it was just too late. Russia had declared war on them. Britain had made 3 demands on them that they'd have to do in order for them not to. And 2 of them they could have done, but one of them they decided they couldn't. And so after that, they were basically in World War One. And that is where we're going to end part 3. And we'll get into the British response and everything else that happened in World War One next week.